forms of aerosol distributions in the atmosphere. The only logical conclusion that I can reach at this point to explain this variance from the expectation of cloud formation occurring repeatedly over and over and over with these aircraft is the introduction of another component to the modeling process, and the most likely component is the introduction of an aerosol particle. When I described the salt situation on the ocean coast more recently, that's exactly the type of situation which leads to an alteration of the normal events. The problem that we're dealing with is that we're looking at the differences between 30% and 70%. That's a huge difference meteorologically.
But in March 2000, when the U.S. Air Force grounded hundreds of KC-135 jet tankers to fix problems in their tail feathers, chemtrail sightings across the United States dropped from 24 locations to just 2. As the big jets were returned to service over the following week, chemtrail activity climbed right back to previous levels. Someone is stealing our skies. You know it's not passenger planes making these patterns, for these close crossing aerial formations often take place far from charted airways or navigational beacons and break all the rules regarding the permitted proximity of commercial aircraft. Watch carefully, and you can see artificial overcasts being made by 3- and 4-engine jet tankers, usually all white or sometimes silver in color. Even individual commercial planes, such as this MD-80 airliner, have been observed with unusually thick trails coming from their tail or wing-mounted engines. In a U.S. Air Force report on owning the weather, Weather Force specialists refer to these spraying operations as aerial obscuration. Contrails like this one usually form at high altitudes when the water vapor in hot engine exhausts momentarily condenses into wispy condensation trails. Though they can sometimes linger, according to the Air Force and Canadian aviation authorities, contrails usually vanish within a minute, like the wake behind a boat. Chemtrails are formed at lower altitudes and do not dissipate. These broad white ribbons are often observed below aircraft flying at higher altitudes that leave no contrails at all. These photographs and video clips were taken in 1999 and the year 2000 over Gabriola Island, Victoria, and Vancouver, British Columbia, Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, Sallisaw, Oklahoma, Santa Fe, New Mexico, Las Vegas, Nevada, Houston, Texas, Columbus, Ohio, and many other locations across the United States. What is going on? After 20 months of research by this investigative journalist and some dedicated researchers, we still don't know for sure. But we do have some compelling clues.
Has there been any type of explanation forthcoming from any official source? When you first started noticing this, did you call anybody? Did you contact anybody with the government and say what's happening here?
There would be several sequences to this, but the first and most obvious one would be that on April 18th of 1999, when over Santa Fe, New Mexico, you have exactly the situation I'm describing of a perfectly clear sky. And on April 18th, there was a fan of approximately 14 to 16 aircraft originating from the mountains over Santa Fe, and those literally formed a fan effect over the whole town of Santa Fe. This was a simultaneous formation. This was not sequential. The aircraft left a simultaneous delivery of these trails that we are speaking of. It looked absolutely remarkable at the time, such that I was motivated to call the air control traffic tower here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I asked the individual, could he explain the activity overhead occurring as we were speaking? This individual paused for about 5 seconds of complete dead silence and then replied, I don't see anything. It looks normal to me. And really, it was in disbelief that I was accepting his response, but I did notice the pause or hesitation. And I said, but this is not normal. This is not normal. And he paused again for several seconds. And he said, I don't know of anything unusual going on in the sky. This was the first case of, unfortunately, many which are witnessed more formally in terms of replies from federal and government officials. And the classic reply is that this is normal. Normal by definition means typical, customary.
A small trail behind them, which dissipates very rapidly. Is that a normal contrail?
It would be, by definition. By definition, a contrail is occurring over time. There is no historical record of what we're speaking of for the last 50 years since the close of World War II, when jets were invented. An isolated instance does not satisfy the observations which are occurring now over the last year and a half, numbering in the hundreds of thousands of individuals that are now recording this.
A normal contrail. An aircraft is at 14,000 feet. Sometimes you can see a small trail behind them, which dissipates very rapidly. Is that a normal contrail?
It would be, by definition. By definition, a contrail is a visible trail of condensed water vapor. That's the name. Contrails, condensed trail. It is water vapor. It's no different in principle between you driving your car down the highway on a cold morning, having some exhaust come from your pipe, and dissipating fairly rapidly. If they were not dissipating and you were leaving a trail, driving across from the East Coast to the West Coast, I am certain that would call attention to it. It's no different than your breath. There's certain physics that are attached to the mixing of water vapor in a humid or not so humid environment. And certainly the expectation is that water vapor, in most cases, is expected to dissipate rapidly. Now, there are exceptions when the air is extremely close to the point of saturation or at saturation, that a case for persistent contrails can occur. But the cases that I'm specifically referring to here, which are so widespread in Santa Fe, New Mexico, are not in such an environment. I'm speaking of an extreme low relative humidity environment here.
Now, I've seen the same thing happen in Phoenix. I got up very early one morning to do a flea market, and we had copies of the magazine there that showed these contrails, and they started forming very early in the morning, and by noon the sky was completely occluded. If these aren't normal contrails, what's an explanation? What's a possible explanation for the purpose of this? Are we talking about some type of weather modification? And if it was cloud seeding, if it was a attempt to make rain, it failed miserably because it never rained, but we did have an overcast cloud. What's a potential explanation for this, or some of the potential explanations?
Yes, Clay, I think fairly early in the investigation, there were several scenarios that appeared to me as being viable explanations, at least for this type of program. And they really haven't changed a whole lot. I'd say they may have added. The first that would come to mind, and these aren't necessarily unique to me, I think it would come to anyone who studies what is happening. The first would be weather modification. That's certainly a strong consideration. As a matter of fact, if we notice the first outlying visitor that came to the website that I maintain, it was the Desert Research Institute, which is a weather modification research institution.
I want to talk about that list a little bit later.
So weather modification is certainly up front in that there certainly is an alteration that is occurring, and the question of rain in itself is another worthy topic if we touch on that later. Second would be the prospect of conducting tests of some type. Test of dispersal rates, test of aerosols that I mentioned earlier, potential test of biological agents. Unfortunately, there is a precedent for such action, so it would not be considered unusual to consider that case. There is a precedent for that. In